The high frequencies were boosted and affected the left channel at the same
Day
time.
tripper.
On the left. Then the lows were
Great
boosted and
day
affected the right
tripper,
channel,
yeah.
and cut in the highs on that right channel feed. It sounds crude today, but back in the 1960s, the record companies drove the engineers to exaggerate these effects to the max, and the result sounded truly awful. In addition to that, the generational tape loss caused by copying created a veil over the sound, which dulled the quality of the original. Emmerich made 2 stereo mixes that day, but despite his best efforts, the result ended up being easily the worst sounding stereo mix in the entire Beatles UK catalogue. Again, they'd underestimated the time these things take, and the planned remix of BTU never happened. The fourth and final mixing session took place on November the 10th. George Martin was again absent, as was Jeff Emmerich, his ears probably still smarting from the previous session. This session was led by EMI balance engineer Peter Brown, assisted by his colleague Greg Kirkby. EMI's doomed plan to sweeten the album for fans already had everything else on it, was the shoehorn in the track Bad Boy, which despite having appeared on the US Beatles 6 album back in June 1965, had yet to be released in the UK. But due to a miscommunication on the telephone between Abbey Road and EMI HQ in Manchester Square, Brown and Kirkby spent the first part of the session mixing This Boy in stereo instead of a Bad Boy. By the time the error was discovered a few days later, it was too late to remix the track, and the original mix which had been made for the US on May the 19th, 1965, had to be used instead. The second song mixed that day was Day Tripper, which replaced the earlier mix prepared on October the 26th, 1965, which eventually turned up on the US album Yesterday and Today, and Greatest Hits Volume 2 in Australia. We Can Work It Out was the final track to be mixed for stereo for this album, and replaced the mix which was made on November the 19th, 1965, which also ended up on Yesterday and Today, and was later scrapped by EMI on August the 9th, 1966. Unfortunately, both Martin and Emmerich, twin 4-track tapes existed for all the other tracks needed, and these were balanced quickly and without fuss. At the side, out of the album's other 15 tracks, just 2, Yesterday and Michelle, had not been released as singles in the UK. Yesterday had been coupled with Dizzy Miss Lizzie for DP 563 in July 1965, and Michelle with Drive My Car as DP 564 1 year later in July 1966. Now let's turn to this album's most recognisable feature, its distinctive cover artwork. As I mentioned earlier, it was no secret that the Beatles were against this album from the start. But was it possible that they tried to sabotage it by refusing to have their images on the front cover? We don't know for sure, but Brian Epstein ended up commissioning young British artist David Christian to come up with a design for the front cover. Following on in a similar vein to Revolver, which was also illustration-based and still selling well at this time, Christian came up with this vibrant pink art design, which captured the spirit of the fashion critiques of Carnaby Street and the retro vibe of London, which was still in full swing. The Beatles themselves appear only on the rear panel in a candid shot taken over a publicity ad inside the on June the 30th. No one ever completely noticed, which was actually printed in reverse. But
Day Tripper, yeah.
on Paul's kimono, and they switched the image on their covers.
I'm gonna be sad.
The album was finally released on December 10th, 1966, though its appearance in the shops did little to quell the breakup rumours, especially as no Beatles were to be seen promoting it or doing anything else. But what the press and public didn't know was that they were already hard at work in Abbey Road, laying down tracks which would eventually produce Sgt. Pepper 6 months later. EMI had naively been expecting Walters to be the biggest album of the year, but that turned out to be one of their biggest miscalculations. In a chart-dominated by the year's biggest-selling album, Sound of Music, and the Pretenders had been by the crowd of monkeys, it was even outperformed by compilations by 2 of their biggest rivals, Rolling Stones' Biggie Inside Type Name Grass, and the best of the Beach Boys. One of the reasons for the album's lackluster performance was simply that many fans just refused to buy it. They felt cheated, justifiably so. After all, they'd spent 2 years writing the biggest records, and here they were, being asked to flip it, 12 shillings for one track. Not like
You're my vibe.
The clear dividing line between Beatles music and real. But for many of my fans who've been with them since 1963, it's stopped here. The album
She
isn't
asked
just a
me on
casual purchase. This record
very
buyer
well.
had maybe never bought a Beatles record before, and probably wouldn't do so again. So instead of being the Christmas present every Beatles fan wanted in 1966, it became the album every Beatles fan gave to their grandparents. The critics didn't help either, slamming the Umai's commercial motivation. But whilst the album would forever be branded as a throwaway failure in the UK, its significance in other parts of the world cannot be overstated. And one of those places was behind the Iron Curtain. If you were a Beatles fan in, say, East Germany or Czechoslovakia in the 1960s, there was very little chance that you would have ever seen, let alone owned, a real Beatles record. As we saw in a previous video on this channel about Czechoslovakia, the communist regime in some Eastern Bloc countries was extremely strict. Pop music was tightly controlled. The Beatles' music was to be heard only as covers by local artists. But in the wake of the Prague Spring in 1968, the communist authorities in Czechoslovakia, anxious to prevent further instability, placated the youth by releasing a real Beatles album, and this was the one they chose. Released in 1969, a collection of oldies was available on the state-run Superfund label, in both stereo and mono. The mono being just a fold down of a stereo. Those who could afford it were now able to enjoy the Beatles music legally and without fear for the first time. They could even read about it too, with a specially written insert which was included in each copy. This Yugoslavian present was renamed Hits of the Beatles, presumably because it was easier to understand than the UK title. It was released almost as a single in the UK issue in early 1967 and contains few versions of every track. The album was also released in East Germany, their state-run record label, in January 1974, in stereo only. This pressing came in a modified cover, which carried a lengthy essay on the rear panel, which praised the Beatles for promoting the ideas of socialism in the West. It was also available as a cassette too, which unlike the UK edition, managed to keep the tracks in the original running. The late 60s and early 70s were incredibly bleak times in these Eastern Bloc countries, and this album must have seemed like a ray of sunshine to rock fans who spent the 60s being starved of Beatles unled music. During the final years I spent in